Okay.
So commission shift is reforming oil and gas oversight by building public support to hold the Railroad Commission of Texas accountable to its mission in a shifting energy landscape. And we were founded 2.5 years ago, in March of 2017. We have a really impressive program portfolio. If you go to the next slide, you can see that we're working across 4 primary areas of fixing the commission, cleaning up oil and gas, taking care of your energy costs, and really just educating the public about what is the Railroad Commission. So tonight we're going to be focusing on just one aspect of all of the great work that we're doing: carbon capture, use, and storage. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Virginia to tell us more.
Thanks, Paige. Thanks, y'all, for joining tonight. Again, we're going to explain all of these key terms and the jargon that you might be hearing about carbon capture, use, and storage, the Railroad Commission, and this thing called primacy in Texas and what that means. And so we'll explain a little bit about the Railroad Commission and how they work. Then we'll kind of get into the 101 on carbon capture, use, and storage. We'll talk about what Class 6 primacy means, and then we'll give an overview of the Railroad Commission's track record on managing injection wells in Texas. And then as we have time, which I think we will, we'll talk about some of the pipeline concerns that we have in Texas and some of the liability issues or liability proposals that came up during the legislative session this year. So the Railroad Commission of Texas is a state agency with 3 elected commissioners. That makes it different than other state commissions where typically the commissioners are appointed. The mission statement of the Railroad Commission is great. You know, their mission is to serve Texas through stewardship of natural resources and the environment, concern for personal and community safety, and support of enhanced development and economic vitality for the benefit of Texans. And so this safety element and the environmental and natural resources stewardship elements are great. That's what we want to see in a mission statement. But I think too often we see the Railroad Commission prioritizing accelerated development that is not always efficient and puts our natural resources at risk and our safety at risk. And then, you can see on this slide that the Railroad Commission has authority over oil and gas extraction and production. They have ultimate authority over determining how much you pay on your gas utility bill. They also oversee pipeline safety for pipelines that start and end within the state of Texas, coal and uranium mining permits, and propane and butane in Texas. Oh. Let's see, I gave away an answer. We're going to do a quick poll to test your knowledge on the Railroad Commission. As I mentioned earlier, the Railroad Commission is an elected commission, and they take campaign contributions. And we're just going to do a quick audience poll to see if y'all can guess what % of Railroad Commissioner campaign contributions come from the companies that they oversee. And so you should see this poll in front of your screen. The options are none, 10%, 30%, 66%, or 100%. So I'll give you another few seconds to answer, and then we'll show the results. Okay, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm ending the poll. Okay. Can y'all see the results? Most people correctly guess that it's 66%. Luckily, it's not 100%, but 2/3 is not really much better. And so this, the fact that the commissioners get so much of their campaign contributions from the same companies that they oversee on the commission is a problem. This leads to conflicts of interest that can create bias in their decision making. And so Campaign donations are one area where we see this potential for bias in the structure of the Railroad Commission. But we also see that the Railroad Commissioners have reported personal financial interests to the Texas Ethics Commission in the same companies that they've been making decisions about. And even though there's a recusal policy at the Railroad Commission, we have never seen one of the commissioners recuse themselves from making a decision about a company that's listed on their personal financial statement. And so that's a concern that we have. And we published a 3-part series that you see here on the screen called Captive Agency. You can find that on our website if you want to know more about these details, especially these cases where sometimes they get donations right before or after a key decision-making moment. Okay, so now let's talk about carbon capture, use, and storage. Sometimes you might hear this referred to as carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. That is a mouthful, so we like to say use and storage instead of utilization and sequestration. We think it's easier. And there are a lot of different ways to do carbon capture out there. In some cases, there's these nature-based solutions, but today we're going to be talking about some of the technological solutions. And specifically when it comes to the storage part, we're going to be talking about underground injection, also known as geologic storage. And so this is a little schematic of how carbon capture, use, and storage works. And so over here on the left, you see capture. The idea is that you could capture carbon dioxide from perhaps a fossil fuel burning power plant, like a coal plant or a natural gas plant, or you could capture it from what's known as a direct air capture facility. And so some of these facilities are like giant fans where they're just collecting ambient carbon dioxide, not necessarily carbon dioxide from an immediate point source that's burning a fuel. And then after the capture process, the carbon dioxide would be pressurized to a supercritical state. That's somewhere between a gas and a liquid. And it would be piped through a pipeline at relatively high pressure. The pressures we're talking about are just over 1,000 PSI. And so some natural gas pipelines are at around that same pressure, but it's pretty high pressure. It's a high pressure range. So this supercritical carbon dioxide goes through the pipeline, and then it can end up in a few different places. And so on this diagram right here, you see saline aquifers. That's one of the primary places where we'll see carbon dioxide stored long-term. However, it can also be stored in salt caverns. And we have a lot of areas like that along the Gulf Coast. And so we'll look more at what this looks like in Texas. Another thing that we already see today is utilization, which is primarily enhanced oil recovery, or EOR. Enhanced oil recovery is sometimes also called secondary or tertiary recovery. And the concept is that when you have an oil or gas well that's pretty much at its end of life, they've taken all of the product out of the well, they can inject fluids into that well to try to get the last remaining drops of oil out of the well. And so sometimes that fluid is water, a lot of times it is, but other times it can be carbon dioxide. And some of the proposals that we've been hearing for a net zero energy future or a low carbon future are relying on the assumption that if you inject carbon dioxide for the purposes of enhanced oil and gas recovery, that carbon dioxide will actually stay in that oil and gas formation. And we will talk about whether or not that might be true later on. And so here's a map of the CCUS landscape today. This is from the Baker Institute at Rice University. And the blue areas that you see, the blue shaded areas that you see across this map in Texas, out in East Texas, all the way down through South Texas, and then out in West Texas and the Permian Basin, those are saline aquifers. So those are some of the areas where you can store carbon dioxide. The pink dots on the map show power plants in Texas where fuels are being directly burned that emit carbon dioxide. And so the idea is that if you can co-locate a carbon dioxide injection well with the same area where the carbon dioxide is coming from, like a power plant, then you will have greater efficiency in sort of storing that carbon. You don't have to pay to transport it as far. As you'll notice out in the map in West Texas, there's a lot of these purple lines. Those represent the existing carbon dioxide pipeline network today. And then these orange dots represent enhanced oil recovery wells in West Texas. Okay, so now I just want to get into a few examples of each segment of this supply chain. So just thinking about carbon capture, one of the concerns that we have with it, actually, I think I forgot to do another poll. Is it time to do the poll page? No?
We can wait until the end.
Okay. All right. Okay, so just looking at carbon capture, it's important to know that out of the 13 largest carbon capture projects worldwide, 7 have underperformed, 2 have failed, and 1 has been mothballed. That's information from IEFA, and that was published this year. And so this is a photo of the Petra Nova plant out in Fort Bend County. This is the sort of experimental carbon capture plant that came to Texas several years ago, and it has never met its emissions targets. This year, because of the Inflation Reduction Act and increased credits going to carbon capture use and storage projects, this facility is back up and running again. But again, you know, the times when we've tested this technology, it has never lived up to the promises that justified the expenditures in the Inflation Reduction Act. And okay. And then when we get into use, again, we're talking about enhanced oil recovery. What I explained earlier is kind of shown on this diagram here on the right, where you would have this oil well. If it's spent, then you would inject water or carbon dioxide over here to a different well, a class 2 well, and then that would help to get more product out of the oil well, which you would then burn and create more carbon dioxide emissions with. And so the Railroad Commission already has what's called primacy over class 2 injection wells. And so we'll talk more about what primacy means later on. But these class 2 wells primarily fall into one of 3 categories. You can have disposal wells that are disposing of salt water that's naturally occurring in oil and gas formations and is produced along with the oil and gas. Or you can have these enhanced oil recovery wells, or you can have hydrocarbon storage wells. So some of the natural gas storage wells that that are used during times of, I guess, the grid getting really close to peak energy use. Sometimes they'll take natural gas out of those storage wells and use it at those times. And so then getting into carbon dioxide storage, here we have the Railroad Commission, and they're seeking class 6 primacy. And so this is the Railroad Commission has to apply to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to get the primary enforcement and regulatory authority over these class 6 wells. This means the Railroad Commission will be able to permit as many class 6 wells as it wants, and it will be the only agency in charge of making sure that those facilities are following the rules for class 6 carbon dioxide injection. And so class 6 wells can only be used for geologic sequestration of carbon dioxide. And so we're talking about long-term containment. For a while, people were sort of casually saying that this would be permanent containment of carbon dioxide. But as we've looked at the rules, we've realized that these class 6 wells can be converted to class 2 wells and used simply as storage wells, which means that you could extract the carbon dioxide from what started as a class 6 well at a later point in time, and then use that carbon dioxide to get more oil out of the ground later on and create more carbon dioxide emissions. And it's important to know there's only 2 class 6 injection wells in the United States today. So this is a technology that has not existed in a widespread commercial fashion yet. Okay, so now we'll talk about the different types of trapping. And so the idea is that if you inject carbon dioxide underground, it will stay underground through through 4 different mechanisms. And so the first mechanism is structural, where you have this caprock layer that just sort of physically keeps the carbon dioxide underground and it can't get out of the caprock. Then you could have residual trapping. And so these are like tiny little pores, either in rock or in soil, where you would have these little particles of carbon dioxide just kind of getting trapped through capillary forces within those pores. Then you could have dissolution trapping, where you actually have the carbon dioxide mixing with water and forming a new kind of saline solution. And what happens when carbon dioxide mixes with water is you get carbonic acid. And we will talk more about the potential dangers of that later on. Then you have mineral trapping. And so carbon dioxide, when it mixes with other rocks or minerals underground, can also mineralize and form a solid, not just another liquid form. And so these 4 mechanisms work at different rates over time. And the chart that you see in the middle here kind of shows you the order of magnitude of how long it takes for each mechanism to work. And so you see that dark blue wedge at the bottom shows that at the very beginning, the caprock is the only thing kind of keeping that carbon dioxide underground. But over time, that becomes less significant of a force in keeping the carbon dioxide underground. And some scientists will tell you that eventually that carbon dioxide could move around so much in the subsurface that it eventually finds a pathway out, even outside of the caprock. Residual trapping, that kind of light blue sliver that you see in between is, again, that's the pore space, that's the carbon dioxide kind of working its way into these tiny little spaces. Starts out as kind of a smaller factor, then kind of like grows at the 100-year time frame as being more significant. Dissolution trapping, where carbon dioxide is mixing with water, takes hundreds of years before it really starts to be a significant effect in the trapping mechanism, and then even tens of thousands of years before it's really solidified there. And mineralization really doesn't start to show much use until the tens of thousands of years mark. And so it's important to realize, like, this carbon dioxide is going to be kind of floating around underground for many, many years before it gets what some might call permanently trapped through dissolution or mineralization. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the US EPA has the authority to grant primacy to states, and Texas is applying for primacy right now. There's 4 different phases in the primacy process. Texas has completed phase 1, the pre-application activities. It got letters from the governor and the attorney general saying that Texas supports this activity. They started a rulemaking process where they brought their rules up to the federal standards. And I think right now we are still in phase 2, where the EPA is still sort of looking at those rules to make sure that they fully match the federal standards. Once we get into phase 3, the EPA will enter a formal application evaluation period, and there will be a 30-day public comment period. And so that will be a really important time for us to all get engaged in this. And then in phase 4, there will be a rulemaking, there will be a memorandum of agreement, and, the program will be formally codified. Okay. I thought I missed the polling opportunity, but in my notes, I have that I'm going to do it right now. So I am going to give y'all another poll. And okay. So the poll that is on your screen says, do you agree that the Railroad Commission is prepared to be the primary permitting and enforcement authority for Class 6 carbon dioxide injection wells? And you can tell us whether you strongly agree, somewhat agree, if you're not sure, if you somewhat disagree, or if you strongly disagree. And these are anonymous, so you can answer honestly. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm ending the poll. And I'm sharing the results. Can y'all see that? Okay. Looks like most people are in the disagree camp. That's interesting. I thought surely some people would be in the agree camp. But another sector is not sure. So we will continue. So at Commission Shift, we do not think that the Railroad Commission should have primacy over Class 6 carbon dioxide storage wells. And I'm going to kind of go into why in this next section. And so we have a lot of concerns about whether the Railroad Commission will adequately monitor this program to be protective of our groundwater. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the Railroad Commission already has what's called Class 2 primacy. This is primarily for disposal wells or enhanced oil recovery. They also have brine mining authority. And as you can see on this slide, they're working on Class 6 carbon dioxide injection. There are 6 classes of underground injection control wells that the EPA oversees and can grant primacy to states on. And so this slide is from the Railroad Commission of Texas. And so you can see that they're reporting here that the total number of Class 2 wells in the state and Class 3 wells is 52,000. And out of those, about 72% of those wells are enhanced oil recovery wells. And about a quarter are saltwater disposal wells. And so some of the problems that we've been seeing throughout Texas appear to be related to these injection wells. And on this slide from the Railroad Commission, you can see that they have given quite a few disposal well permits out in District 8 out of the total that were granted statewide in 2022. And so District 8 is this light green area of West Texas that you see. Right here where my cursor is Pecos County. And just above that is Ward and Crane County. And we will talk about those areas in just a second. Okay, and so one of the big problems that we've seen throughout Texas related to underground injection and Class 2 wells is earthquakes. This is also called induced seismicity. And so this map that you see on the screen is a seismic response area that the Railroad Commission set up. And they've set up a few different seismic response areas throughout West Texas because there have been so many earthquakes caused both by hydraulic fracturing, but predominantly by Class 2 underground injection wells. And so in November and December last year, there were 2 magnitude 5.4 earthquakes that really rattled the area. Some of those earthquakes could even be felt hundreds of miles away in San Antonio and Austin. So really some pretty big tremors. And this, what you're seeing on the map and these red dots here represent only the counties in the Gardendale seismic response area, but there are several other seismic response areas there throughout West Texas. Okay, and so the Railroad Commission, it's worth noting that they, as a part of this seismic response program, they have been limiting injection rates for wells that are 9,000 feet deep or greater, but it's not clear that they're doing enough to limit injection for shallow wells, which probably have a bigger impact on our aquifers. This is an orphan well blowout from Refugio County or Refugio County. This is down in the Gulf Coast in South Texas. And so the landowner, Molly Rook, her dad had been after the Railroad Commission for years to plug the orphan wells on their property. And the commission never came out and plugged the wells. And after he passed away, Molly inherited that problem. And she was asking the Railroad Commission for years to plug the wells, and they never got out and plugged the wells until this blowout happened. There was a water flood enhanced oil recovery project going on nearby. And this well blew out and sprayed salt water and volatile organic compounds all over the surrounding wetland and killed all the vegetation. And after that, the Railroad Commission came out to control the well once Molly started posting about it on social media. And but they still didn't plug all of the orphan wells that were in the area. And it wasn't until she filed a lawsuit against the commission that they finally came out and plugged the wells. And so there are close to 8,000 orphaned wells throughout the state of Texas right now. On average, in the past several years, the Railroad Commission has been plugging around 1,300 wells per year, but they've been taking on more orphaned wells every year than they plug. And even with the new federal funds coming on board, they're not going to be plugging that many more orphaned wells each year. So I think that by the end of the 7-year federal program, we will probably have just as many orphaned wells on the books as we do today. Other than orphaned wells, we have a problem with inactive unplugged wells. And so the difference between an orphaned well and an inactive unplugged well is that an orphaned well has no responsible operator on file, and the Railroad Commission has to be the one to plug that orphaned well. An inactive well still has an active operator. It's not orphaned, but it's been left unplugged or it was improperly plugged. And so the well that you see on this slide is an example on Antina Cattle Ranch out in Ward and Crane counties, Texas. They started having wells blow out a couple of years ago. These are wells that are currently under the name of Chevron. And what they found is that when they go in and plug one of the wells, another well will start leaking. These folks are also out there digging up old wells that were supposedly plugged and finding out that they were never in fact plugged. They have no cement, or some improper material was shoved down the hole, like a carpet or wood or cardboard, or sometimes there was just a metal cap put on the hole and the well was not cemented all the way through. So there are a lot of potential conduits for injection fluids to be coming out of the ground. Throughout Texas, we have around 113,000 inactive unplugged wells that have been inactive for more than 12 months and should be plugged. But these operators keep getting extensions for plugging their wells. There's another 35,000 or so that are just shut in, and they've been shut in for less than 12 months. They might come back online if the price of gas increases. Out of the 113,000 that have been inactive for more than 12 months, 17,000 of those have been inactive for more than 20 years. And these wells will be very expensive to plug, because what starts to happen with these aging wells is they start to collapse in, and it takes longer to take materials out so that you can eventually plug the well all the way through. Operators do plug around 7,700 of these wells each year, but at that rate, it would still take around 20 years to plug all the inactive unplugged wells in Texas. So we're not really moving fast enough. This is an example of an undocumented well that was not in the Railroad Commission's database. Someone later found some documentation on this well in the Midland Energy Library and attributed it to Chevron. But then once Chevron came out, they found another well bore about 10 feet away and said that that one matched their records more closely than the one that you see blowing out on this screen. You know, the kind of pressure that we see coming out of this well is likely not natural. It is likely to be influenced by the injection wells that we see in this area. And then there's the story of Beamer Lake. So Beamer Lake is a 60-acre saltwater lake in Pecos County. It's flowing at a rate of 400 gallons a minute from a formation called the San Andreas. It has high levels of radionuclides and hydrogen sulfide, and it's 4 times saltier than the ocean. Just last month at the Railroad Commission open meeting, they approved permits for 3 new Class 2 disposal wells into the same formation that this water is coming out of. And the technical examiner at the commission actually recommended denying the permits because there is no market need for those injection wells. But Commissioner Christian asked for those permits to be approved anyway, and to substitute the company's proposed findings of fact and conclusions of law. On this slide, you see that this is a P13 well. And so the Railroad Commission has a process where if it permits an oil and gas well and the operator later decides that it doesn't need the well, that operator can transfer the well to a landowner to use as a water well. And so what we have seen is that the Railroad Commission is refusing to acknowledge that these P13 wells meet the state definition of an orphaned well, and they won't use state funds or federal funds to plug these P13 wells, even major disaster sites like Beamer Lake. Another major disaster site caused by a P13 well is this sinkhole on FM 1053. It's about the diameter of 5 football fields, and every time it rains, it opens up the road. TxDOT is talking about spending $27 million to reroute this road. And that's the landowner, Skylar White, that you see in that photo on the right. The Diceta sinkhole is another sinkhole in a different part of Texas. This is closer to East Texas between Houston and Beaumont. This sinkhole formed in 2008, but this year it recently started growing. There is a Class 2 disposal well located 1/10 of a mile from the edge of that sinkhole, as you see in this map on the right. And this is a currently active injection well, despite the sinkhole growing. And so if these seem like just anecdotes and stories, it's important to acknowledge that these types of effects from Class 2 injection are well documented in scientific literature. There have been correlations between the timing of injection rates and geologic uplift or subsidence, the sinkholes, as well as many studies that have explored induced seismicity related to earthquakes. And so our biggest question is that if the Railroad Commission can't properly manage 70-year-old oil and gas wells and is clearly mismanaging Class 2 injection wells, then what is going to happen to these carbon dioxide injection wells of the future? And so let's go ahead and talk about pipelines for a minute, because the Railroad Commission also has authority over pipeline safety for those pipelines that start and end within the state of Texas. And so right now, there are about 5,000 miles of carbon dioxide pipelines in Texas, and there is a projected build out of around 65,000 miles. And Paige can correct me in the chat if I'm getting that number wrong. This is a map that was published in The Guardian in March of 2021 that showed where the projected carbon dioxide build out would be throughout Texas and other states. And well, I guess we can't really raise hands very easily, or I can't see your hands even if I asked, but I'm wondering if anybody has heard of this particular incident. And so there was a carbon dioxide pipeline explosion caused by a Denbury Gulf Coast pipeline back in 2020. There was a landslide that caused this pipeline to become unstabilized and explode. And when the carbon dioxide was released, it sank. That's what carbon dioxide does as a chemical. It doesn't kind of evaporate into the air. It tends to sink and stay down. And so it formed a plume over this roadway. And when cars drove through the plume, their engines shut off because they couldn't get enough oxygen to fully combust the gasoline. And the people who were caught in that plume became hypoxic. They were convulsing and foaming at the mouth and having asthma attacks. About 40 people, as you see on this slide, went to the hospital. And thankfully, PHMSA did issue its second highest penalty ever to this company. But now ExxonMobil is getting ready to buy up, actually, I think they just did buy up Denbury Gulf Coast Pipeline. This is Michaela Burns. She was one of the people affected by that incident. If you look at this article that's cited on the page, Gassing of Satartia, you can hear audio of her call, her mother's call to 911, and she's like just gasping in the background because she has asthma and this severely affected her. This is DeBray Burns. He has experienced chronic short-term memory loss. He said that he hasn't been able to find a job, and his daughters had to move out of his home because he couldn't support them anymore. And he also is no longer able to cook on the stove. If he cooks, he has almost burned the house down several times. And Our concern with the Railroad Commission is that we don't see very stringent safety oversight at this point for natural gas pipelines or hazardous liquids pipelines in Texas. There's no oversight over common carrier claims in Texas. So if a pipeline company wants to claim eminent domain and take your property to put in a pipeline, all they have to do is check a box on a Railroad Commission form, and the Railroad Commission doesn't check to see if that's a valid claim. You would have to sue that company as a landowner or as a person affected by that to be able to address that issue. And natural gas leaks and explosions in Texas are common. We see hundreds of pipeline safety incidents being enforced on the Railroad Commission open meeting agendas every month. And so, despite those enforcement actions, they're not really doing enough to prevent these incidents from happening. And finally, I don't know if I said this before, but it's very important to underscore, there are currently no federal or state pipeline safety regulations for carbon dioxide pipelines right now. This is extremely important when we think about whether this ought to be a widespread commercially available technology. Finally, let's take a quick look at the Texas legislature and their feelings on carbon dioxide. So there were a couple of big bills that came up during the legislative session this year. One would have addressed carbon dioxide companies' liability during operation, and the other one would have considered liability after operation. And so House Bill 4557 did pass the House. It did not pass the Senate, so it is not enacted yet, but it has been scheduled for a hearing in January during the legislative interim. And this would have limited companies' liability during operation throughout the entire carbon dioxide use and storage pipeline. So carbon capture companies, pipeline companies, and carbon dioxide injection wells. It would have made it very difficult for a person to file a claim against a company if they had caused any kind of harm to that person that was non-economic. So like injury or some other kind of like personal harm. And it would have also declared that carbon dioxide is not a nuisance or a pollutant. That means that the state couldn't really do anything if the carbon dioxide was leaking from a pipeline. It would not be considered a pollutant. The company wouldn't have to go find or fix that leak. And nuisance claims are one of the only ways that people affected by pollution can claim damages or recover damages when they lose something from that kind of pollution. SB 2107 would have transferred liability for a Class 6 injection well to the Railroad Commission within 10 years of the well being closed. We don't do that kind of liability transfer for any other industry in Texas. And so it was very odd that proponents of CCUS were trying to get this kind of special carve out just for CCUS. On the left of your screen here, you see Bruce Gates, the CEO of Agron Energy. Bruce talked about, he's an oil and gas operator, and he talked about a situation where he knew that there was a CO2 acid gas plume that he had to drill through to access the minerals he was trying to get. And so he prepared for that. The Railroad Commission knew about it. And when he drilled through that plume, it ate through his heavy-duty 5-inch drill bit in a matter of 12 hours. And he testified that this could be a really serious concern if that kind of acid gas ended up going back up through an unplugged well, which we know we have many of in Texas. This bill, thankfully, did not pass. It did make it through the Senate with a very whittled down version of the bill that only defined who owns the pore space, whether it's mineral owners or landowners, but it did not make it through the House. Despite these bills not passing, I'm bringing them up to you because I think that they will come up again. And I think that we all need to be careful if these kinds of facilities are coming into our neighborhoods to speak up when those proposals do come up, because we don't want our groundwater to be impacted and we don't want our livelihoods to be impacted. And I think that one of the really important points here is that the Texas legislators that we heard from on these committees did not talk about climate change. They did not talk about the need for us to address extreme weather as a result of climate change, or biodiversity loss, or impacts on low-income communities on the coast. They talked about wanting to be able to compete and sell gas to Europe and make lots of money. Many of them talked about trying to make sure that CO2 never gets regulated as a pollutant and that there's never a limit on CO2. And as I mentioned before, the current rules that we see from the EPA would allow a Class 6 well to be converted to a Class 2 well so that you could eventually get that carbon dioxide out and use it for enhanced oil recovery. So it's not clear that these legislators are wanting to see any kind of limitation on this waste that we're producing when we burn fossil fuels. And so the last 2 points that I want to leave you with is that Texas is not ready for widespread commercial deployment of CCUS. And we are a very good place to do that, as you saw from the map earlier. We have lots of saline aquifers and lots of potential for storing this stuff. But this is overall a risky and unproven technology for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. As I mentioned at the top, out of the 13 largest carbon capture projects worldwide, 7 underperformed, 2 failed, and 1 was mothballed. And so if we're primarily using carbon dioxide for enhanced oil recovery, we're going to be accessing oil that never would have been produced otherwise. And we're going to perpetuate this cycle of producing waste just so that the same company that made the waste can get paid to inject it underground. And that's not a way to limit a pollutant. And so with that, I'm going to give y'all one last poll. We're going to do one of the polls that we did earlier again and see if anyone's opinions have changed. So I'm going to launch this poll. Okay, so do you agree that the Railroad Commission is prepared to be the primary permitting and enforcement authority for Class 6 carbon dioxide injection wells? And the options are strongly agree, somewhat agree, not sure, somewhat disagree, or strongly disagree. Okay, I'll give 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. These results were a little more decisive than the last time. So it's interesting to see that. I'll go ahead and stop sharing. And Paige, can I pass it to you to talk about how folks can take action on Railroad Commission's primacy application?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that great presentation. We've put together this petition. It just launched this evening, so you could be one of the first few folks to sign and send an email to Region 6 Administrator, EPA Region 6 Administrator, Dr. Nance, to let her know that we don't want the state of Texas to have primacy over Class 6 injection wells. And so feel free to click on the link in the chat. Thanks, SJ, for sharing that. And we would love it if you were to share it with your networks. Our goal is to get 1 million signatures on this petition that represents 3% of the population in the great state of Texas. And so we're doing our best to kind of share this with everyone who cares about safe and clean drinking water, which is one of my top favorite things. You can also sign up for our newsletter if you're not already getting that. We just send it once a month, and it's full of amazing recaps of what we're doing and upcoming events. Please be sure to do that so that you don't miss our future webinars. And with that, I think, are there any final closing thoughts before we stop recording? Let's stop the recording.